Rain drummed against the cracked linoleum, washing away the copper stench of a stranger's mistakes. 5 years ago, Nora shoved a dying man under her floorboards while police flashlights swept her living room. She didn't ask for his name. She just wanted the sirens to stop. She thought she bought her peace with a bottle of cheap antiseptic and a stolen suture kit. But debts in this city don't expire. They ferment. And tonight, the man with the bullet hole in his shoulder is back to collect. It was a Tuesday when the world decided to bleed on Nora's doorstep. She was 22, running on 4 hours of sleep and the chemical adrenaline of cheap, acidic coffee. Her apartment in the South End was a ground-floor box that smelled permanently of boiled cabbage and damp concrete. She lived there because rent was $300 a month, paid in cash to a landlord who only communicated through grunts and aggressively slipped eviction warnings under the door. At 2:14 a.m., the rain was coming down in sheets, heavy enough to drown out the usual sounds of the neighborhood: the screaming matches, the shattering glass, the revving engines. Nora was sitting on her lumpy mattress, staring at a stack of overdue utility bills when the thud hit her window. It wasn't a tap. It was the heavy, sickening smack of dead weight against the glass, followed by a wet, sliding sound. Nora froze. Her first instinct, honed by years of surviving in a zip code the city had abandoned, was to turn off the single table lamp. The room plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the rhythmic, sickly yellow flash of the broken street lamp outside. She held her breath. The silence stretched, broken only by the rain. Then came a low, wet scrape against her door. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the two-burner stove. Barefoot, the cold linoleum biting into her heels, she crept to the door. She didn't look through the peephole. The peephole was broken, stuffed with a piece of gum. Instead, she pressed her ear to the cheap wood, breathing, ragged, wet, and shallow. Nora unlocked the deadbolt, the chain, and the secondary slide lock. She cracked the door open an inch. A body fell inward, wedging the door open. Nora stumbled back, raising the skillet. The man was face down on her floor, half inside the apartment, half out in the torrential rain. He wore a dark wool overcoat that was heavy with water, and something darker, something thick that was already pooling on her faded entryway rug. The smell hit her immediately. It was sharp, metallic, like a handful of old pennies mixed with wet asphalt and sweat. "Hey," Nora whispered, her voice tight. "Hey, you can't be here. Get up." He didn't move. In the distance, the shrill, rising wail of police sirens sliced through the noise of the rain. They were close. 2 blocks, maybe less. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Nora's chest. The cops in the South End didn't ask questions. If they found a bleeding man in her doorway, they would tear her apartment apart, arrest her for obstruction, and she'd lose her job at the clinic by morning. She dropped the skillet. It clanged against the floorboards. She grabbed the man by the lapels of his coat and pulled. He was incredibly heavy, dead weight wrapped in wet wool. Her shoulders screamed in protest, the muscles burning as she dug her heels in and dragged him entirely inside. She slammed the door shut, locking it blindly with shaking fingers. The sirens grew deafening. Blue and red lights began to stroke the walls of her living room through the thin grey curtains. The man groaned. He rolled onto his side. In the flashing police lights, Nora saw his face. He was young, maybe 30, with sharp, brutal features pale from blood loss. His hand clamped around her ankle. The grip was terrifyingly strong, his fingers slick and cold. "Quiet," he breathed. It wasn't a plea, it was an order. Fists pounded on the glass of her front window. "NYPD! Open up!" Nora's heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked down at the man. then at the narrow closet door beside her tiny bathroom. She dragged him by his uninjured arm, her bare feet slipping on his blood. She shoved him into the closet, wedging his broad shoulders between her winter coats and the vacuum cleaner. "Don't make a sound," she hissed, kicking a pile of dirty laundry over his legs. She shut the door. She ran to the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of bleach from under the sink, and splashed it onto the floor where his blood had pooled. She threw an old towel over it, wiping frantically with her foot as she moved toward the front door. She ruffled her hair, pulled her oversized t-shirt off one shoulder, and unlocked the door, leaving the chain on. "What?" she snapped, squinting through the crack as if she'd just been woken up. 2 cops stood in the rain. The one in front had his hand on his holster. He looked wired, his eyes darting. "We're looking for a suspect. Caucasian male, dark coat. Fled down this alley." "I was sleeping," Nora lied, her voice thick with fake exhaustion, masking the tremor underneath. "I haven't heard anything except the rain." "Open the door, miss." "Do you have a warrant?" Nora asked. It was a stupid, risky question. But submitting too easily in this neighborhood made you look guilty. The cop sneered, water dripping from the brim of his cap. He shined his flashlight straight into her eyes, then swept it past her into the dark apartment. The beam illuminated the unmade bed, the stack of bills, the damp towel on the floor. It stopped on the towel. The scent of bleach was overpowering. "Spilled my coffee," Nora said flatly. "Look, if there's a guy bleeding out there, I don't want him in here either. Check the dumpsters at the end of the block. The locks on the gate are busted." The cop stared at her for a long, agonizing second. Then a radio crackled on his shoulder. "Suspect spotted on 4th and Main." Without a word, the cops turned and ran. Nora locked the door. She leaned against it, sliding down until she hit the floor. Her hands were shaking violently. She sat there for 5 minutes, listening to the rain, before she pushed herself up and walked to the closet. She opened the door. The man had passed out. Nora didn't call an ambulance. She dragged him into the bathroom, turned on the glaring overhead light, and stripped off his coat. A bullet had gone clean through his upper left shoulder. It was messy, ugly work. She grabbed her stolen clinic supplies, gauze, surgical tape, a bottle of cheap vodka, and a sewing needle sterilized with a lighter. She poured the vodka over the wound. The man woke up with a violently stifled roar, his body arching off the tiles. "Hold still," Nora commanded, her voice harsh to cover her nausea, "or I'll drag you back outside." He glared at her, his eyes dark and feverish, but he gripped the edge of the bathtub and let her work. She packed the wound, stitched the torn skin with clumsy, desperate efficiency, and bound his shoulder tight. She didn't offer him comfort. He didn't ask for it. The only sound in the bathroom was his ragged breathing and the clinking of her scissors against the porcelain sink. When she was done, she left him sitting on the bathroom floor. She went to the kitchen, threw up in the sink, washed her mouth out, and sat in her single chair until the sun came up. When she checked the bathroom at 7 a.m., the man was gone. The only proof he had ever been there was a single, blood-smeared $20 bill resting on the edge of the bathroom sink. 5 years is enough time to let a memory calcify into a scar. It doesn't disappear, but it stops hurting when you press on it. Nora was 27 now. She no longer worked at the clinic, having been fired for stealing the very supplies she used to patch up the bleeding man in her bathroom. Now, she worked the graveyard shift at Patsy's, a diner that sat on the border between the financial district and the industrial park. It was a purgatory of neon and grease, catering to insomniacs, exhausted truck drivers, and suits who had stayed at the office too long. Her life was an exercise in cynical routine. She woke up at 8 p.m., put on a stiff polyester uniform that was the color of dried mustard, and took the subway to work. She clocked in, poured coffee that tasted like burnt battery acid, wiped down sticky vinyl tables, and ignored the world. She liked the numbness of it. Ambition was a liability. Caring was a trap. If you kept your head down, served the meatloaf, and didn't look the junkies in the eye, you survived. It was 3:15 a.m. on a Thursday. The diner smelled like stale fryer oil and the lemon-scented ammonia Nora used to clean the countertops. Her lower back throbbed, a dull, persistent ache that had become her constant companion. She leaned against the back counter, rolling a stiff neck, watching the sparse crowd. In booth 3, a truck driver was snoring softly into his folded arms. In booth 7, 2 teenagers were crying over a shared plate of cold fries. "Hey, Nora, you're spacing out." Nora blinked. Dave, the line cook, was glaring at her through the pass-through window. He wiped his greasy forehead with the back of a tattooed arm. "Table 4 needs their hash browns and the coffee pots are dead." "I'm on it," Nora muttered, her voice raspy. She grabbed the heavy ceramic plate, ignoring the heat radiating through the bottom, and dropped it on table 4 in front of a man in a rumpled suit. He didn't look up from his phone. "More coffee?" she asked mechanically. He shook his head. Nora walked back to the coffee station. She grabbed the glass pot, carried it to the industrial sink, and began to scrub it. As the hot water hit the glass, a faint scent of rust drifted up from the drain. Nora froze. Her hands tightened around the pot. It was a phantom smell, a psychological glitch. Ever since that night 5 years ago, Nora smelled copper whenever she was overly tired or stressed. The memory of the wet wool coat, the heavy dead weight of the man, the sticky warmth of his blood on her bare feet. It was all locked away in a tight little box in her brain. But sometimes the box rattled. She had moved out of the South End apartment exactly 2 weeks after the incident. She'd spent her meager savings on a deposit for a slightly better, slightly safer place across town. For the first year, she slept with a kitchen knife under her mattress. She flinched at loud noises. She checked the locks 4 times a night. But time eroded paranoia into exhaustion. The bleeding man never came back. The cops never knocked down her door. The incident became a surreal, ugly dream. She convinced herself he probably died in an alley somewhere a few days later. Men like that didn't live long. She dumped the dirty water out of the pot, her reflection staring back at her from the stainless steel sink. Dark circles rimmed her eyes. Her hair, tied back in a messy knot, was dull. She looked exactly like what she felt she was, a ghost haunting her own life. She dried her hands on her apron, aggressively rubbing the skin over her knuckles. Another tick. She always felt like her hands were dirty. "You're going to rub the skin off," Dave noted from the grill, scraping a metal spatula against the griddle with a harsh, grating sound. "Take your break. You look like you're going to pass out into the fryer." Nora didn't argue. She untied her apron, threw it over a stool, and walked out the back door into the alley. The air was frigid, biting through her thin uniform. It was autumn, the kind of cold that carried the threat of winter. She leaned against the brick wall of the diner, pulling a crushed pack of cigarettes from her pocket. She didn't smoke often, only when the phantom smells got too strong. She lit the cigarette, inhaling the harsh, chemical smoke. It burned her throat, but it grounded her. It erased the smell of copper. She looked down the alley. It was empty, illuminated by a single caged bulb above the door. A stray cat darted behind a rusted dumpster. Nora exhaled a long plume of smoke, tilting her head back against the brick. This was it. This was her life. Earning minimum wage, hiding from the world, counting pennies. It wasn't fair, but Nora had stopped believing in fairness a long time ago. Fairness was a luxury for people who didn't know what blood smelled like when it soaked into a cheap rug. She flicked the half-smoked cigarette into a puddle, watched the ember sizzle out, and pushed off the wall. It was time to get back to the meatloaf. The shift changed at 4 a.m. It was the dead zone. The truck driver left. The crying teenagers left. It was just Nora, Dave scraping the grill, and the hum of the neon sign in the window buzzing like an angry hornet. Nora was behind the counter, counting the meager tips from her apron pocket. 4 crumpled dollar bills and a handful of quarters. She stared at the money, a bitter smile twisting her lips. At this rate, she could afford a new pair of shoes by next summer. The bell above the diner's front door jingled. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. Nora didn't look up immediately. She swept the coins into her hand, shoved them into her pocket, and grabbed a damp rag. "Sit anywhere you like," she called out, her voice flat, practiced. "Coffee's fresh." She turned around, expecting a tired cab driver or a drunk wandering in from the financial district. Instead, the air in the diner changed. It wasn't a sudden drop in temperature, but it felt like it. The atmosphere grew heavy, thick with a sudden, suffocating tension. The ambient noise of the diner, the hum of the refrigerators, the hiss of the grill, seemed to drop an octave. 3 men stood just inside the door. They were wearing dark suits, not the cheap, rumpled kind the desk jockeys wore. These suits were tailored, expensive wool. Crisp lines. The men didn't look around for a seat. They stood perfectly still, their hands resting loosely in front of them, their eyes sweeping the room with cold, professional efficiency. Dave stopped scraping the grill. The spatula hung frozen in his hand. Nora stopped wiping the counter. Her heart gave a single hard thump against her ribs, then began to race. Her survival instincts, dormant for 5 years, violently kicked awake. A 4th man stepped out from behind the 3 at the door. He didn't walk like the others. He moved with a quiet, terrifying grace. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal overcoat that hung open over a dark suit. As he stepped into the harsh fluorescent light of the diner, Nora saw his face. The rag slipped from her fingers. It hit the floor with a wet slap. He was older. The sharp, brutal edges of his face had matured into something harder, something carved from stone. His dark hair was neatly styled, but it was the eyes she recognized. Cold, dark, and heavy. He turned his head slightly, scanning the empty booths, and the light caught a thin, pale scar that jagged along his jawline and disappeared beneath his collar. It was the bleeding man. Nora couldn't breathe. Her lungs forgot how to expand. She stood behind the counter, her hands gripping the formica edge so hard her knuckles turned white. The man walked toward the counter. He didn't look at Dave. He didn't look at the dirty coffee pots. He looked only at Nora. He stopped at the stool directly across from her. He unbuttoned his coat and sat down. The vinyl stool creaked under his weight. He rested his hands on the counter. His hands were large, immaculate, a heavy gold ring gleaming on his right index finger. Up close, he didn't smell like copper and wet asphalt anymore. He smelled like cold cedar, expensive leather, and clean linen. It was a rich, dominating scent that completely overpowered the grease and ammonia of the diner. Silence stretched between them. It was thick, suffocating. Nora fought the urge to step back. If she stepped back, she showed fear. If she showed fear, she was prey. She forced herself to stand her ground, though her knees were trembling so violently she was sure he could hear them knocking together. "What can I get you?" she asked. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat, hating herself for the weakness. "Coffee?" The man watched her. His gaze was analytical, dissecting her. He took in her cheap uniform, the dark circles under her eyes, her white-knuckled grip on the counter. "Black," he said. His voice was low, a deep rumble that vibrated in the air between them. Nora turned around. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the coffee pot. She poured the black liquid into a thick ceramic mug, spilling a little over the side. She grabbed a napkin, wiped the spill with jerky movements, and placed the mug in front of him. "Cream or sugar is on the table," she said, staring at the middle of his chest. "I don't need it," he said. He didn't touch the mug. "You look tired, Nora." The sound of her name in his mouth was a physical blow. She flinched. She hadn't given him her name that night. She had never spoken it. Nora looked up, meeting his eyes. The fear was still there, cold and sharp, but anger was beginning to bleed into it. The protective cynicism she had built over 5 years flared. "How do you know my name?" she asked, dropping the waitress persona entirely. Her voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "I know everything about you," he said calmly. "I know you were fired from the clinic for stealing gauze and lidocaine. I know you moved to an apartment on 8th Street 2 weeks after we met. I know you make $14 an hour here, and you are currently 3 months behind on your student loans." Nora's stomach plummeted. "Have you been following me?" "No," he said, adjusting his cuff. "I only started looking for you 3 days ago. It took my men 4 hours to find you." He gestured vaguely toward the 3 men standing silently by the door. "Why?" Nora demanded. Her heart was hammering against her throat. "I saved your life. I dragged your heavy ass into my bathroom and stitched you up like a torn sofa. I didn't call the cops. I didn't say a word. You left. We're done." The man tilted his head slightly. A ghost of an expression crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but something close to amusement. It didn't reach his eyes. "I left a 20, he said softly. "It didn't cover the carpet cleaning," Nora shot back, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. He fell silent. He looked down at the coffee mug, tracing the rim with his thumb. "My name is Vincent Costa." Nora didn't gasp. She didn't need to. Everyone in the city knew the name Costa. They were the invisible architecture of the city. They owned the shipping yards, the unions, the sanitation contracts, and half the politicians. They were violent, ruthless, and untouchable. "I don't care who you are," Nora lied, her voice shaking. "I want you to leave." Vincent looked back up at her. The amusement was gone. His eyes were flat, dangerous. "I don't leave debts unpaid, Nora. It's bad for business." "I don't want your money," she said firmly. "I just want you to pretend you never met me." "It's not about money," Vincent said, leaning forward slightly. The movement forced Nora to lean back. "I owe you my life. That is a heavy debt. But you also made a mistake, Nora." "What mistake?" "You saved me," Vincent said quietly. "Which means the men who tried to kill me that night failed. And because they failed, they spent the last 5 years looking for the person who helped me disappear." The blood drained from Nora's face. The buzzing of the neon sign suddenly sounded deafening. "They found the landlord of your old building yesterday," Vincent continued, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "They know it was a girl on the ground floor. They are currently looking for a 27-year-old former clinic nurse with a habit of stealing medical supplies." Nora gripped the edge of the counter. The diner spun slightly. No, I covered it up. I bleached the floor." "You did," Vincent agreed. "But you dropped a bloody towel in the alley dumpster. A neighbor saw you." He stood up. The movement was smooth, commanding. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, tossing it onto the counter. It landed with a heavy, solid thud next to the cold coffee. "Patsy sold this diner 3 days ago," Vincent said. "To me. Your lease on 8th Street. My holding company bought the building yesterday." Nora stared at him, horror crawling up her spine. "What are you doing?" "I am claiming my debt," Vincent said, buttoning his coat. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Pack whatever you can fit in a single bag. You have 10 minutes. After that, this diner burns to the ground, and Nora is officially dead." He turned and walked toward the door. "Wait!" Nora yelled, her voice breaking. Vincent paused, looking back over his shoulder. The 3 men by the door parted for him. "Where are we going?" she asked, the fight draining out of her, leaving only raw, freezing terror. "Home," Vincent said. He walked out into the cold autumn night, the bell jingling cheerfully behind him. Dave dropped the metal spatula. It clattered against the greasy floor mats, breaking the spell. He didn't look at Nora. He didn't ask questions. He just stripped off his apron, threw it onto the grill where it immediately began to smoke, and bolted out the back door into the alley. Nora stood alone behind the counter. 10 minutes. Her brain felt like it was packed with wet cotton. The raw animal part of her screamed to follow Dave out the back, to run into the maze of the industrial district and disappear. But she knew the men in the tailored suits would be waiting. Vincent Costa didn't leave loose ends. He didn't make empty threats. She turned and ran to the cramped employee break room. The air back here smelled intensely of stale cigarette smoke and sour mop water. Her locker was a rusted metal box that squealed when she yanked it open. Inside was the sum total of her existence: a faded denim jacket, a cracked leather purse, a half-empty bottle of ibuprofen, and a pair of worn-out sneakers. She dumped the purse onto the small folding table. Keys to an apartment she no longer owned. A cheap flip phone, a tube of chapstick, $24 in crumpled tips. Her hands shook violently as she shoved the items back into her purse. She stripped off the mustard yellow uniform shirt, her skin prickling in the freezing air of the back room, and pulled on her civilian clothes, a grey sweater that was unraveling at the cuffs and her denim jacket. She didn't have a bag. She didn't have anything worth packing. When she pushed back through the swinging door into the main diner, the smell hit her. Gasoline. Raw, sharp, and choking. 2 of Vincent's men were casually splashing liquid from heavy plastic jerry cans over the vinyl booths, the Formica counter, and the commercial fryers. They moved with a bored, practiced efficiency. The liquid pooled on the cracked linoleum, soaking into the cheap rugs. Nora walked toward the front door, her boots splashing softly in the puddles of accelerant. The fumes burned her eyes, making them water. Vincent was standing on the sidewalk, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the street lamp. A long black SUV idled at the curb. The engine was a low, powerful purr that vibrated in the soles of Nora's feet. One of the men inside tossed a lit match over his shoulder. The whoosh of ignition sucked the oxygen out of the room. The heat hit Nora's back like a physical shove, a wall of blistering air that smelled of melting plastic and incinerated grease. She stumbled forward out the door, gasping, the sudden temperature shift shocking her lungs. She turned around. Patsy's diner, her purgatory for the last 4 years, was a cage of orange and blue fire. The neon sign in the window sparked wildly, hissed, and shattered. "Get in," a voice said. Vincent was holding the rear door of the SUV open. He wasn't looking at the fire. He was looking at her. Nora hesitated. The heat of the burning building warmed her back, but the interior of the SUV looked like a black hole. It was a threshold. Once she crossed it, the cynical, quiet, invisible life she had scraped together would be entirely gone. The wail of fire engines began to echo in the distance. She climbed into the SUV. Vincent slid in beside her, the heavy door slamming shut with a solid, airtight thud that instantly severed them from the noise of the street. The interior of the car was a sensory deprivation chamber. The windows were tinted so darkly that the burning diner outside looked like a muted television screen. It smelled of expensive leather, ozone from the climate control, and the sharp, clean scent of cedar that radiated from the man sitting inches away from her. The SUV pulled away smoothly. No tires squealing, no rush. Just a calculated, inevitable departure. Nora pressed herself against the passenger door, putting as much space between them as the plush seat allowed. Her knees were pulled tightly together, her hands gripping her cheap purse like a shield. She stared at the back of the driver's head, a thick-necked man named Arthur, who drove with terrifying stillness. "You're breathing too fast," Vincent noted. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet cabin. He didn't turn his head to look at her. "You're going to hyperventilate." "You just burned down my job," Nora whispered, her voice rasping against her dry throat. "You bought my apartment. I don't have anywhere to go." "You have exactly where I put you," he replied smoothly. "I'm not a piece of furniture." The anger flared again, a brief, hot spark against the crushing weight of her panic. She turned to look at him. In the passing shadows of the streetlights, his profile looked like it was carved from granite. "What do you want from me? You paid your debt. Why not just let them kill me? It would be cleaner for you." Vincent finally turned his head. His eyes were impossibly dark, absorbing the faint light in the car. "Because I don't like people touching what belongs to me," he said. Nora's stomach hollowed out. "I don't belong to you. The men looking for you are the Antonovs," Vincent continued, completely ignoring her protest. He spoke with the clinical detachment of a surgeon, explaining a fatal diagnosis. 5 years ago, they tried to take my territory in the ports. They ambushed me. You stitched me up. Because I lived, I dismantled their entire operation in 3 weeks. I killed 2 of their lieutenants. I crippled their supply lines. The remaining Antonov brother, Grigory, has been hunting the phantom who saved my life ever since. To him, you are the reason his empire collapsed." He shifted slightly, the fine wool of his suit whispering against the leather seat. "If Grigory finds you, he won't just kill you, Nora. He will make an example of you. He will peel your life apart, layer by layer, and then he will do the same to your skin." Vincent's tone didn't elevate, but the words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "So, yes, you belong to me now, because the alternative is a closed casket." Nora closed her eyes. The phantom smell of copper bloomed sharply in the back of her nose, mixing with the scent of cedar. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window, watching the city blur past, realizing with a sickening certainty that she had just traded a graveyard for a cage. They drove for an hour. The neon bleed of the city gave way to the sparse, sodium-lit stretch of the highway, and eventually to total darkness. The SUV turned onto a private road that wound upward through dense, old-growth trees. The tires crunched rhythmically over fresh gravel. When they finally stopped, the doors unlocked with a sharp click. Nora stepped out into the biting night air. They were in the courtyard of an estate that looked less like a home and more like a modern fortress. It was a sprawling structure of dark stone, steel, and expansive bulletproof glass that reflected the surrounding forest. There were no warm porch lights. Security cameras tracked their movement with faint whirs. The silence here was absolute, lacking the ambient hum of traffic, sirens, or screaming neighbors. It was a heavy, oppressive quiet. Inside, Vincent ordered softly, walking past her. She followed him up the wide stone steps. Arthur keyed a code into a discreet panel, and the massive front doors swung open silently. If the outside was a fortress, the inside was a mausoleum of wealth. The foyer was vast, paved in cold, slate-grey marble that amplified the sound of their footsteps. There were no photographs, no clutter. The walls were decorated with stark, abstract paintings that looked like bruises on canvas. Nora stood awkwardly in the center of the room. Her ratty sneakers squeaked slightly on the pristine floor. She smelled like fryer grease, stale sweat, and fear. Beside her, Vincent stripped off his overcoat, handing it to an older, silent woman who appeared from a side hallway like a ghost. "Show her to the East Wing," Vincent told the woman. He didn't look back at Nora. He rolled his shoulders, loosening his tie. "Lock the exterior doors." "Wait," Nora said. Her voice echoed too loudly in the cavernous space. Vincent stopped at the base of a sweeping glass staircase. He turned, his expression carefully blank. "Am I a prisoner?" she asked, her hands balling into fists at her sides. She needed the boundary lines drawn. She couldn't survive the ambiguity. Vincent studied her. The exhaustion was written deeply into the lines of her face. Her shoulders were rigid, braced for a blow. "You are a guest who requires protection," he said. "Guests can leave." "You can walk out the front door whenever you choose, Nora," he replied, his voice dropping to that dangerous, quiet register. "But the gate is 5 miles down the road. The woods are rigged with motion sensors, and if you make it to the highway, Grigori's men will have you before sunrise. You are not a prisoner here. You are simply out of better options." He turned and walked up the stairs, his footsteps completely silent. The older woman stepped forward. She wore a simple dark dress and possessed a face completely devoid of expression. "Follow me, please." Nora followed. They walked down a long hallway, lined with tall, arched windows that looked out into the pitch-black forest. The air in the house was perfectly climate-controlled, lacking the drafts and dampness of her old apartments. Yet she felt freezing. The woman opened a heavy oak door at the end of the hall. "Your room. The bathroom is through the left door. There are fresh clothes in the closet." "Thank you," Nora muttered. The woman nodded once, backed out, and pulled the door shut. Click. Nora stared at the brass handle. She walked over and gripped it, twisting hard. It didn't budge. The lock had engaged from the outside. A sharp, hysterical laugh bubbled up in her throat. Not a prisoner. She turned around and took in the room. It was larger than her entire previous apartment. A massive, king-sized bed dominated the center, covered in a dark grey duvet that looked like a storm cloud. A sitting area with 2 leather chairs sat by a massive window. It was beautiful, sterile, and entirely impersonal. She dropped her cheap purse onto the floor. It tipped over, spilling her chapstick and her handful of crumpled tips onto a hand-woven Persian rug. The sight of the dirty, mundane items against the immense luxury broke something inside her. Her legs gave out. She sank onto the floor, pulling her knees to her chest, and pressed her face into her arms. She didn't cry. Crying was a release she couldn't afford. Instead, she just sat there, listening to the agonizing silence of the estate, feeling the adrenaline slowly, painfully draining from her muscles. Eventually, the chill of the floorboards seeped into her bones. She pushed herself up and walked to the bathroom. It was a temple of white marble and glass. She turned on the shower, letting the water run until steam filled the room, fogging the mirrors. She stripped off her clothes, throwing the unraveling sweater and the denim jacket into a corner. She stepped under the scalding spray. The heat was a shock to her system, burning her skin, turning it an angry red. She grabbed a bar of soap that smelled faintly of cedar and scrubbed. She scrubbed her arms, her neck, her chest, trying to wash away the smell of Patsy's diner, the smell of the burning gasoline, the phantom smell of copper. She scrubbed until her skin felt raw. She closed her eyes, letting the heavy torrent of water drown out the thoughts racing through her head. 5 years of hiding, of making herself small, of surviving on the scraps of the city, only to be dragged back into the bloody orbit of the man whose life she saved. When she finally stepped out, her reflection in the partially defogged mirror looked like a stranger. Her eyes were hollow, her wet hair plastered to her skull. She found the clothes the woman had mentioned in the massive walk-in closet. They weren't guest clothes. They were brand new, tags removed. A pair of soft, charcoal grey sweatpants and a heavy cashmere sweater. She put them on. They fit perfectly. The realization sent a fresh wave of cold dread down her spine. He knew her shoe size. He knew her measurements. He had built this cage specifically for her, long before he ever walked into the diner. Nora climbed into the massive bed, pulling the heavy duvet up to her chin. The sheets were incredibly soft, sliding against her skin like water. It was the most comfortable bed she had ever laid in, and she had never felt more terrified. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise, listening to the silent house breathe around her. Morning did not announce itself with the rumble of garbage trucks or the screaming of neighbors through thin drywall. It arrived as a slow, grey light creeping through the massive windows of her room. Nora hadn't slept. Her body was a tight coil of tension, her nervous system completely misfiring. At 8 a.m., the lock on her door clicked loudly, echoing in the quiet room. She sat up, pulling the duvet defensively against her chest. No one entered. The click was simply the electronic release of the lock. She threw off the covers. Her bare feet hit the hardwood floor. The cashmere sweater she wore was impossibly soft against her skin, a textural reminder of how out of place she was. She walked to the door, opened it a crack, and peered down the long hallway. Empty. Her stomach gave a vicious, loud rumble. She hadn't eaten since a piece of burnt toast at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. Survival meant eating, regardless of the circumstances. She stepped out of the room. The house felt different in the daylight, but no less intimidating. The stark, grey walls and massive windows made it feel like a modern art museum. Beautiful to look at, but not meant to be touched. She navigated her way back to the grand foyer and found an arched doorway that smelled faintly of roasted coffee and butter. She followed the scent into a kitchen that belonged in a culinary magazine. Stainless steel, black marble countertops, and an island large enough to sleep on. Vincent was sitting at a small glass table near a bay window that overlooked a manicured lawn sloping down toward the tree line. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a dark, fitted Henley shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders and dark slacks. The lack of a jacket made him look physically larger, the corded muscles of his arms entirely visible. He was drinking coffee and reading a tablet. Standing a few feet away, leaning against the counter with a mug in his hand, was a younger man with a broken nose and eyes that darted around the room like a cornered rat. Nora froze in the doorway. The younger man noticed her first. His hand twitched toward his waistband before he caught himself. "Who's this?" Vincent didn't look up from his tablet. "Nora. She's staying with us." He swiped a finger across the screen. "Bennett, tell me why the shipment in Port 4 was delayed by 3 hours." Bennett, the man with the broken nose, swallowed hard. "Customs Patrol changed their shift rotation. We had to wait them out. We couldn't risk the containers being opened on the dock. I pay the customs supervisor $30,000 a month to ensure shift changes do not happen unannounced," Vincent said. His voice was entirely conversational, completely stripped of anger. That lack of emotion made the words infinitely more terrifying. "He said it came from above him," Bennett stammered, his knuckles turning white around his coffee mug. "Internal affairs." Vincent finally looked up. He set the tablet face down on the glass table with a quiet tap. "If internal affairs is sniffing around port 4, it means someone on the docks got talkative," Vincent stated. He looked at Bennett, the silence stretched, thin and brittle. "Find out who. Cut their tongue out. Leave it on the customs supervisor's desk." Nora's breath hitched. She took a step back, her heels scraping against the tile floor. Both men looked at her. Bennett's eyes narrowed, sweeping over her borrowed clothes. Vincent's gaze was different. It was heavy, calculating. He watched the blood drain from her face, watched her chest rise and fall with sudden, rapid breaths. "Bennett, get out!" Vincent ordered softly. Bennett didn't argue. He set his mug down on the counter and practically bolted past Nora, giving her a wide berth as he disappeared down the hall. Nora stood glued to the doorway. The phantom smell of copper rushed back, thick and suffocating, flooding her sinuses. It mixed nauseatingly with the rich scent of the coffee brewing on the counter. She looked at Vincent's hands, large, steady, resting loosely on the table. The same hands she had covered in blood 5 years ago. "Sit down," Vincent said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Nora didn't move. "You're going to cut someone's tongue out. I am going to protect my business," Vincent corrected calmly. "Sit down, Nora. There is food." He pointed to a covered silver platter in the center of the table. Her legs moved before her brain could stop them. The deeply ingrained instinct to obey the most dangerous thing in the room took over. She walked stiffly to the table and sat in the chair opposite him. She didn't reach for the food. She kept her hands firmly in her lap, her fingernails digging into her palms. "You're terrified of me," Vincent observed. He picked up his coffee mug, taking a slow sip. "You just ordered a mutilation over breakfast," Nora shot back. Fear made her voice sharp, stripped of its usual dull apathy. "Should I be making small talk?" Vincent set the mug down. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the glass table. "You know exactly what I am. You knew it the night you dragged me out of the rain. A man with a bullet in his back who can't go to a hospital is not a saint. I didn't care what you were," Nora said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I just wanted you out of my apartment, so the cops wouldn't arrest me." "Pragmatism," Vincent nodded slowly. "I appreciate that. You need to apply that same pragmatism now." He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against the edge of the silver platter. He pulled the lid off. Beneath it was a plate piled with eggs, thick-cut bacon, and toasted bread. The smell was aggressively rich, making Nora's empty stomach clench violently. "Grigory Antonov is not a pragmatist," Vincent said, his eyes locking onto hers. "He is a fanatic. If he gets to you, he will torture you to hurt my pride, and then he will kill you. I am a monster, Nora. I won't deny that. But right now, I am your monster. And as long as you are inside these walls, nothing will touch you." Nora stared at the food. The steam rising from the eggs blurred her vision slightly. The contradiction was paralyzing. The man sitting across from her was ruthless, violent, and commanded a network of cruelty that she couldn't even fathom. He had ripped her life away, burned down her job, and locked her in a gilded cage. Yet, he was the only reason she was breathing this morning. "Eat," Vincent commanded softly. Nora slowly pulled her hands from her lap. Her fingers were trembling. She picked up a fork. The silver felt heavy, foreign in her grip compared to the cheap plastic cutlery she was used to. She took a bite of the eggs. They were perfect, buttery, melting in her mouth. She chewed, swallowing past the tight knot of fear in her throat. Vincent watched her eat. He didn't pick his tablet back up. He just sat there, a silent, immovable force, anchoring her to this terrifying new reality. Nora kept her eyes on her plate, the metallic taste of adrenaline slowly fading, replaced by the bitter realization that she had survived 5 years in the shadows, only to be dragged directly into the sun. And the sun was burning her alive. 3 days blurred into a single, continuous stretch of suffocating quiet. The estate was a marvel of modern architecture, but to Nora it was a terrarium. She spent her hours pacing the length of the east wing. She learned the exact number of steps from her bedroom door to the massive window at the end of the hall. 74. She learned that the climate control system hummed a low, barely perceptible B-flat. She learned that the older woman who brought her meals was named Martha, and Martha possessed the unsettling ability to move without making a single sound on the hardwood floors. The luxury was offensive. The sheets were Egyptian cotton, the food was meticulously plated, and the water pressure in the marble shower was perfect. It felt like a bribe. Every soft texture and rich meal was designed to make her forget that she was trapped. It didn't work. The phantom smell of copper lingered at the edges of her senses, flaring up whenever the house grew too quiet. She missed the harsh, chemical burn of cheap coffee. She missed the abrasive scrape of her polyester diner uniform. Those things belonged to her. This cashmere, this marble, this forced safety. It belonged to Vincent. By the evening of the 4th day, the inactivity turned toxic. Her skin felt too tight. The nervous energy that had kept her alive in the South End was cannibalizing her from the inside out. She left her room at 10 p.m. The house was dark, illuminated only by recessed floor lights that cast long, sharp shadows against the slate walls. She walked barefoot toward the west wing, a part of the house she hadn't yet explored. The air grew cooler here, smelling of old paper, leather, and a sharp metallic tang that made her pulse spike. Gun oil. Nora paused outside a heavy oak door left slightly ajar. A single desk lamp threw a pool of yellow light across a massive mahogany desk. Vincent sat in the center of the light. He wasn't wearing a jacket or a tie. The sleeves of his white dress shirt were rolled up to the elbows, exposing forearms corded with muscle and laced with faint, silver scars. Spread across a dark microfiber cloth in front of him were the disassembled pieces of a semi-automatic handgun. He moved with mechanical precision. A small brush swept over the slide. A rag soaked in solvent wiped down the barrel. The metallic snick and clack of the metal components snapping back into place was the only sound in the room. Nora stood in the doorway, her breath shallow. She should have turned around. She should have gone back to her 74-step hallway. "You walk heavy on your left heel," Vincent said. He didn't look up. He slid a coiled spring into the gun's frame. "An old injury?" Nora stiffened. "I slipped on ice 3 winters ago. Couldn't afford a doctor to set the ankle properly." "It healed crooked," he noted, finally picking up a rag to wipe the excess oil from his hands. "I can have a specialist look at it tomorrow. Break it. Reset it." "Don't touch my ankle," Nora snapped. The words were out before she could temper them. The sheer arrogance of his offer, to break her bones just to fix a limp she had lived with for years, ignited a hot, bright spark of fury in her chest. She pushed the door open completely and stepped into the room. Vincent looked up. His dark eyes locked onto hers, registering the defiance. He didn't look angry. He looked vaguely fascinated. "I am going insane in this house," Nora said, her voice shaking but her jaw set. She crossed her arms over her chest, digging her fingernails into the soft cashmere of her sweater. I can't just sit in that room, waiting for the sky to fall. I need something to do. Read a book. There are 3,000 of them in this room, Vincent replied, gesturing vaguely toward the towering shelves lining the walls. I don't want a book. I want a job. Vincent set the assembled handgun down on the desk. The dull thump of the heavy metal against the wood made Nora flinch. You are a target, Nora. You are not an employee. He leaned back in his leather chair, the leather groaning softly under his weight. Your only job is to stay entirely out of sight while I dismantle what is left of the Antonov syndicate. I am not a piece of porcelain, she argued, stepping closer to the desk. The smell of the solvent burned her nose, but it was real. It was grounding. I survived the South End for 5 years. I survived scraping grease off a diner grill. I can handle doing laundry. I can cook. Let me do something, or I am going to lose my mind. Vincent stared at her. He studied the dark circles under her eyes that a week of luxury hadn't erased. He studied the tense, defensive line of her shoulders. You want to be useful, he murmured, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register that vibrated in her chest. I want to earn my keep. I don't take charity. A sharp, humorless exhale escaped his lips. This isn't charity. This is a quarantine. He reached into the top drawer of his desk and pulled out a thick manila folder, tossing it onto the edge of the mahogany surface. You were a nurse. A clinic aide, she corrected instinctively. I didn't have a degree. I just knew how to stitch, bandage, and triage. Pragmatic medicine, Vincent said. The kind that doesn't ask for ad insurance cards. He tapped the folder with a heavy gold ring. I have a crew of 12 men who rotate through the port detail. They get bruised, they get cut. Occasionally they get broken ribs from loading accidents. They cannot go to a hospital without drawing police attention. Nora stared at the folder. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Martha will show you the basement dispensary tomorrow, Vincent continued, his eyes flat and entirely unreadable. Inventory it. Throw out what is expired. Make a list of what you need. From now on, when one of my men bleeds, you patch them up. Nora slowly reached out and pulled the folder toward her. The thick paper was rough against her fingertips. It was a terrifying concession. By taking this job, she was no longer just a protected asset. She was becoming a functioning gear in the Costa machine. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice a hollow whisper. You could just lock me in that room and ignore me. Vincent stood up. He was a foot taller than her, his presence immediately dominating the space. He leaned over the desk, invading her personal space. The scent of gun oil completely gave way to his sharp, cold cedar cologne. Because a caged animal that has nothing to chew on will eventually chew off its own leg, Vincent said softly. And I need you whole, Nora. He turned off the desk lamp. The room plunged into shadows. Inventory starts at 8, he said from the darkness. Don't be late. The illusion of safety shattered exactly 48 hours later. It was 2:14 a.m. Nora knew the time because she was awake, staring at the glowing red digits of the alarm clock on her nightstand. Her ankle ached, a dull throb that flared up whenever it rained. And it was raining tonight, a torrential, driving downpour that battered the bulletproof glass of her window, sounding like a handful of gravel thrown against a tin roof. She was tracing the line of a faded scar on her wrist when the heavy oak door to her bedroom violently slammed open. Nora bolted upright, a scream catching in her throat. Vincent stood in the doorway. He was fully dressed in black tactical gear, a Kevlar vest strapped tightly across his chest, a suppressed automatic rifle hanging from a sling over his shoulder. The terrifying, quiet grace he usually possessed was gone, replaced by a jagged electric urgency. "Get up," he barked. "Shoes on, now." "What? Now, Nora?" The roar vibrated off the walls. Panic, icy and absolute, flooded her veins. She scrambled out of bed, her hand shaking so violently she could barely grip the laces of the worn sneakers she had refused to throw away. She shoved her feet into them, not bothering to tie the strings. "Coat," Vincent ordered, grabbing a heavy wool jacket from the closet and tossing it at her. It hit her in the chest. "Put it on. Keep your head down." "Are they here?" Nora gasped, her voice cracking. "They breached the lower gate," Vincent said, grabbing her upper arm. His grip was a steel vise, bruising and inescapable. He practically dragged her out of the room. The mole at the port gave them the access codes to the private road. "We are leaving." The house was chaotic. The pristine, museum-like silence was gone, replaced by the heavy thud of combat boots, the frantic shouting of men, and the terrifying, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of assault rifles being racked and loaded. Vincent dragged her down a back stairwell she had never seen before. The air here was damp, smelling of concrete and exhaust. They emerged into a subterranean garage bathed in harsh, red emergency lighting. Two black, heavily armored SUVs were idling, their massive engines roaring, pumping thick white exhaust into the cold air. Arthur was behind the wheel of the lead vehicle. "Get in the back. Floorboards." Vincent shoved her toward the open rear door of the first SUV. Nora stumbled, her untied shoelace catching under her heel. She pitched forward, hitting her knees hard against the metal running board. Pain flared, sharp and sickening, but the adrenaline instantly swallowed it. She crawled into the back, wedging herself into the narrow gap between the front and rear seats, curling her body into a tight ball. Vincent slid in right above her, slamming the heavy armored door shut. "Go!" he yelled. The SUV lurched forward with neck-snapping violence. The tires screeched against the concrete before catching, launching the heavy vehicle up the exit ramp and out into the torrential rain. Nora pressed her face against the gritty floor mat. It smelled intensely of wet rubber and old dirt. She clamped her hands over her ears, her eyes squeezed tightly shut. Her breathing was entirely out of control, jagged gasps tearing at her throat. "Keep your head down." Vincent's heavy boot nudged her shoulder, pinning her lower. They hit the private gravel road at 70 miles an hour. The SUV fishtailed slightly, the heavy armor throwing off its center of gravity. Arthur fought the wheel, his face a mask of furious concentration in the rearview mirror. "They're on our tail!" Arthur shouted over the roar of the engine. Nora opened her eyes just in time to see the cabin light up with blinding, strobe-like flashes from the rear window. A fraction of a second later, the noise hit. It wasn't like in the movies. It wasn't a clean, distant popping sound. It was a deafening, concussive roar that physically battered her eardrums. The heavy caliber bullets struck the reinforced back windshield with the force of sledgehammers. The thick glass didn't shatter, but it spider-webbed violently, a milky white starburst of fractured layers appearing inches above Vincent's head. "Drive, Arthur," Vincent roared, rolling down his window 3 inches and shoving the barrel of his rifle out into the rain. He returned fire. The concussive shockwaves of his weapon, firing inside the enclosed cabin, were agonizing. Nora screamed, burying her face into her knees, the smell of cordite and burned gunpowder instantly filling the air, choking her. The SUV swerved violently to the left, tossing Nora against the door panel. Her shoulder slammed into the metal. "RPG!" Arthur screamed. The world turned white. The explosion didn't hit them directly, but it detonated close enough to the right front tire that the shockwave lifted the 3-ton SUV off the ground. Time dilated. Nora felt weightless for a terrifying, agonizing second. Then gravity reclaimed them. The SUV slammed back onto the asphalt with a sickening crunch of metal and shattering suspension. The impact threw Nora upward, but a heavy weight instantly crushed her back down to the floorboards. Vincent had thrown his body entirely over hers. The vehicle spun out of control, tires shredding against the wet road. It skidded sideways for 50 yards, the agonizing screech of metal on asphalt drowning out the rain, before slamming violently into the thick trunk of an old-growth pine tree. The airbags deployed with a cloud of acrid white dust. Then, a terrifying, absolute stillness fell over the car. Nora lay pinned beneath Vincent's massive frame. Her ears were ringing with a high-pitched, continuous whine. She couldn't breathe. The weight on top of her was crushing her lungs. She opened her mouth to gasp, tasting blood and the bitter chemical dust of the airbags. "Vincent," she rasped, her hands weakly pushing against his tactical vest. He didn't move. Outside, the crunch of boots on wet gravel began to approach the crippled vehicle. Flashlight beams cut through the rain, and the thick smoke pouring from the crushed engine block, sweeping over the shattered windows. Nora's heart stopped. The metallic smell of blood returned, but this time it wasn't a phantom memory. It was real, hot and sticky, dripping steadily from Vincent's armor onto the back of her neck. "Check the cabin," a heavily accented voice ordered from the darkness. Nora squeezed her eyes shut, a single terrified tear cutting through the dust on her cheek. The cage had broken, but the monsters were waiting outside. The gilded cage has officially been shattered, and Nora is trapped under the weight of her protector in a violently broken SUV. With Grigory Antonov's men closing in and Vincent bleeding out, is this the end of the line for our cynical protagonist? Will she find a way to drag him out of the fire a second time? Or are they both going down in the rain? Let us know your survival theories in the comments below. If your heart is pounding as fast as ours, hit that like button, share this video, and make sure you're subscribed, and thank you for listening.